Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to Musical Talk. My name's June. What's yours?
Sing out, Louise!
Oh, get my mother out of here. Well, actually, of course, I'm Thos Ribbits, and I think you probably knew that. And you probably know what we're going to be talking about today if you know anything about musical theatre and have been listening attentively to today's rather ridiculous opening. Of course, we're going to be looking at GYPSY, one of the great musical theatre shows, originally produced in 1959, with a book by the amazingly talented and yet awful man Arthur Lawrence, with an amazingly robust score by Julie Stein, born in Bethnal Green but raised for the most part in America, and of course lyrics by a young Stephen Sondheim. And it's certainly a show that, whilst it represents the last great flowering of the golden age of musical theatre on Broadway, certainly is also a transitional piece, because you can feel a Sondheim-esque thread running through not just the lyrics, but actually the book. Now, as we said in last week's episode of Musical Talk, Christmas in 2015 in the United Kingdom was marvellous because musicals were on the television in a way that they very rarely are. And in this case, live musicals. We discussed last time the Sound of Music live. I think on the whole a very successful experiment of doing a show actually live on television. And we talked about how the constraints of live television left the production team with a Hobson's choice when it came to how they were going to do it, as they could neither do it cinematically, because of its live nature, and they didn't really want to do it as a stage show which was being telecast, meaning that they had to do it in what now seems a slightly old-fashioned way, but was in fact using the grammar of television. Well, that was on ITV. A few days later, on BBC 4, the BBC's principal television arts channel, we were treated to GYPSY Live. Now, in this case, GYPSY was put on in a very different way, and it's interesting to compare and contrast, because this was a case of a stage show that's been running very, very successfully with amazing reviews and amazing numbers of stars for its performers and for the production in London throughout 2015, being telecast. And by that, I mean cameras going into the theatre, the Savoy Theatre in this case, and filming a live performance as it took place in front of an audience, which of course is a very different thing to what ITV did with their Sound of Music Live. But we discussed that last week. Today we're concentrating on GYPSY. As I said, before it even got onto the television screen, it had been setting all the reviews aflame. Imelda Staunton had been spectacular as Mama Rose, with Peter Davison playing a very sympathetic Herbie, the one-time theatrical agent and long-suffering man who spends most of the show with her. Now, briefly, let's talk about the history of the show. As I say, first produced in America in 1959, it was based on the memoirs of Gypsy Rose Lee, who was a famous striptease artist. She'd published her memoirs in 1957 and was terribly famous at that time. In fact, as we'll mention a little later in today's programme, this isn't the only time that Gypsy Rose Lee gets featured in a famous musical. There's at least one song all about her and her very distinctive act and her very distinctive personality in another show, which, as I say, we'll mention later. Now, it's fairly famously well known that Gypsy Rose Lee's memoirs were going to be turned into a musical by the producer David Merrick. It seemed like a really good idea, so Jerome Robbins, the famous choreographer, quickly joined the team, and so did Leland Hayward as a co-producer, which ensured that Ethel Merman was attached to the project because she wanted him to produce her next show. They then went to Arthur Lawrence, the famous book writer of many a successful Broadway show, who initially wasn't that interested in writing the story, but when he looked a little more into it, he suddenly realised the book wasn't really about Gypsy Rose Lee herself. It was actually about her domineering, stage-loving mother, who has been described as the ultimate show business mother, a well-known stereotype in theatrical circles even to this day. Amazingly, the score was originally offered to Irving Berlin and Cole Porter, but both of those people didn't want to do it, and so it eventually went to Stephen Sondheim. Now, what's interesting to note is all three of those were approached to write both the music and the lyrics together. But, as you probably know from the well-known show business story, Ethel Merman wasn't going to have an unknown composer, as she saw it, writing the score for her big show, so she insisted on Julie Stein, who agreed to do it, at which stage Stephen Sondheim removed himself from the project as he didn't want to just write lyrics anymore, but was actually persuaded by his surrogate father, if you like, that's Oscar Hammerstein II, that it would be a very good idea to take the job on, and of course it absolutely was. The show ran on Broadway in 1959 and was a huge hit and ran for 702 performances, and it's been revived on and off for the half-century since then, and it shows no signs of abating. And why should it? It's a brilliant show. The version that the BBC was broadcasting was the stage version at the Savoy, which had originally started at the Chichester Festival Theatre in 2014. The Chichester Festival is now becoming one of the big feeders into the West End in terms of musical theatre. That, of course, is where the recent Sweeney Todd came from, that featured Michael Ball and Imelda Staunton, who, of course, turns up as Mama Rose in this Gypsy. It transferred to London on the 15th of April 2015 and ran for a limited time until the 28th of November, garnering all manner of praise throughout. The cast was Imelda Staunton as Rose, as I've said, Peter Davison as Herbie, Lara Pulver as Louise, Gemma Sutton as June, Anita Louise Coombe as Tessie, Louise Gold as Mazeppa, and Julie Legrand as Electra. Those last three are, of course, the famous strippers who turn up and steal the show in the last 15 minutes with You've Got to Have a Gimmick. That London production won Best Musical Production, and Imelda Staunton won Best Performance in a Musical at the UK Theatre Awards in 2015, and also won Best Musical Performance at the Evening Standard Awards that same year. Now, that's quite enough about the history of Gypsy. Let's get down to the meat of today's episode. I met up with Tim Sayward, with whom I discussed The Sound of Music live, and we went on also to discuss Gypsy live on BBC 4. So let's now listen to that conversation with Tim Sayward to find out if we thought that Gypsy live was a success. Musical talk. Tim.
Hello.
I had a dream last night.
Was it a wonderful dream?
It was. Now, I was lying in bed and you were dressed as a pantomime cow and you came up to me and said, let's put on a show.
I always do that.
Yes, you do actually. I've been meaning to complain.
Yes.
So, having stepped out of a dream, that's a different song entirely.
Yes.
Obviously, we're very obliquely referencing, I think,
Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
and his cow,
Yes.
which was on in all pantomimes this year.
The goat.
Seriously, we're talking about Gypsy,
Yes.
and most specifically the live version of Gypsy, which was on BBC 4 this Christmas.
Yes.
Unlike the Sound of Music live, which ITV put on, and which we discussed in another episode of Musical Talk.
Performed as it went out, yep.
That's right. This was a telecast of a stage production,
Yes.
the version of Gypsy, which has won
It was
star
a
after
live
star.
recording.
Yes. Well, it was really.
Yeah, that's right.
At the Savoy Theatre. So, first things first, Gypsy is an amazing piece.
Yes.
It really is. It's an early Sondheim lyric. It's a profoundly intelligent piece, actually, emotionally, in its own way.
Yes. It's also perhaps the last of the... Well, it's sort of the last musical that is of the classic genre of musicals.
Yes.
And yet again the first of the sort of self-reflexive genre of musicals.
It's a transitional
It
piece,
predates
isn't it?
Cabaret and Chicago, which also belong to that sort
Yeah.
of first generation of musicals about musicals or musicals about theatre.
And is that because of the personnel involved in the original production, do you think? You've got people like Julie Stein, who represents the old Broadway,
Absolutely, so.
although he went on a longer than that.
Yes.
You've
Well,
got
I mean, like Jerry
Sondheim.
Herman did.
Yeah, you've got Sondheim, who represents new Broadway, if you like.
Yes, such
You've
as
also
it was,
got the
yeah.
old guard, such as Ethel Merman, representing old Broadway
Very
and
much
insisting,
so,
in
yes.
fact, upon Julie Stein being the composer originally.
Yep.
So you've got the backward-looking and the forward-looking all meeting together to make something that's a little bit special.
Well, it is a love letter to vaudeville, rather, I should say, and to Broadway too. So it's an affectionate sort of tribute, but of course it sees beneath it, and a lot of the numbers would have been done, as it were, straight in
Yes.
the years past. They have a sort of layer of irony over them, or a layer of nostalgia and memory as well. You know,
Well, you are expected to identify one or two of the vaudeville acts as being bad.
a bit like with Follies. I mean, for example, you know, where there's a sort of whole sequence of things there, and of course, like Chicago later on as well, where you're invited to look back on the thing, but it sort of reflects. Here, though, it's a slightly different technique to Candor and Ebb, because it's not reflecting on a political thing. It is just telling us a story, but from the old days of showbiz.
It's also dissecting a type, isn't it?
Yes.
Which is the stage mother.
The pushy stage mother, yes.
Writ large, I should say. Before we get on to this particular production at the Savoy, You've always had a fondness for Gypsy, haven't you? There have been various versions of it. There's been the original stage
and
play.
I haven't known it that long, but I've in the musical theatre society that I was in as a kid, we learned Everything's Coming Up Roses in its non-ironic form, which we did, of course, and without really knowing the context. But so I've known some of the numbers for longer than I've known the actual show.
And I remember a few years ago you started raving about the DVD recording of the Bette Midler version, which was made for American television a few years ago.
Now, I've never seen the Rosalind Russell movie version, which I think is from 1961 or thereabouts.
Everyone was surprised at the time of the casting of that.
That's right.
And indeed, it is a slightly lacklustre version of what could have been.
And the Bette Midler version, I think, is generally thought to have rather knocked that one out of the park.
Surpassed it, yes.
Absolutely, although I've never, as I say, seen the Rosalind Russell version. But this latest one, I think, may go yet further.
Now, why is that? We have Imelda Staunton as Rose.
I do think that's the most significant factor, really, actually, in this. I mean, first of all, because it's sort of staged, whereas the Bette Midler version is a TV movie, I mean, with, I think, very little location work. I think it's all done, again, on sound stages, like we were saying, The Sound of Music Live recently was done. And so it has...
Although it's a show that allows that.
Yes, absolutely. So the Bette Midler version isn't a theatrical presentation of it. It's a sort of semi-theatrical presentation.
Yeah.
It's more made for TV.
It's a televisual thing. If we're making that genre classification.
Whereas this places it on the stage, and the fact that it's on a stage, I think, does bring back the memories of the stage shows to which it refers more strongly.
Yes. The only oddness about that is, of course, it's at the Savoy, which is one of our 1920s theatres.
Yes.
Which is very much not the kind of theatre you can imagine vaudeville or musical really taking place in. Some of the West End musical venues, some of the theatres, the Matchams, the Frank Matcham designed theatres, beautiful Victorian or Edwardian theatres, and although they may not have been used for musical, you can absolutely imagine musical taking place.
Yeah.
Whereas actually at the Savoy, that's much less the case. However, it's not really about the venue. It is about it being a proscenium stage, isn't it? Really?
That's right, it is, and the way it's presented, and there's a little bit of walkout space out the front of the orchestra pit as well, which gets made good use of.
Well, that's a very vaudeville thing. You see that also in real musical, where you can walk round and in front of your orchestra pit.
Exactly, yeah. So I think it fits those well. I don't know how much of the production was, in a sense, a revival of earlier productions of it. I mean, this was the Chichester Festival Theatre production that transferred to the West End. There have been in recent years. There was the Patti LuPone famously on Broadway. In a revival of Gypsy, and certainly...
And it's been non-national tour, both in America and
Britain.
Well, exactly. Basically, every time, it has to be said, a respected actress of a certain age comes along,
yes.
Angela Lansbury, Tyne Daly,
yes.
People like that. There's been lots of them.
A production of Gypsy. But a certain amount of the choreography I did recognise was common to both the TV version and to this version.
Oh, right.
Mainly in the Dainty June and Baby June sequences, so I assume that those are either very prescribed very well in the script or have barely been changed over the sort of the decades since it first originated.
Although in a way that would make more sense, because although you can choreograph the speech marks, the contemporary drama of what's going on around the stage parts, if those stage parts are the worst of the formula of vaudeville, because the one thing about Rose is, whatever her dreams and her ambitions are, it's very clear that she is an awful dramaturg, composer, writer, director. She doesn't get it, and so they are the worst kind of formula.
They're very cleverly written, because obviously there are two sort of big challenges in this, one on the writing side and one on the acting side, and this isn't the main part actually, but so the writers, or Sondheim in particular, had to write lyrics that weren't terribly good in order to make it plausible, which must have made him want to sort of crawl out of his own skin, I expect, at the time.
Well, it's got an extra level of puzzle, hasn't it, as well, because Let Me Entertain You, which is the worst of the screechy kind of vaudeville numbers, comes back time and time again, until it finally hits the mark as a burlesque number, when it has to work, but it's the same lyric. The same lyric has to work in a sexy, titillating way, in the same way as an annoying, screechy 8-year-old girly kind of way.
Exactly. And so there's that, and there's also, of course, the part of Louise, which has to be played as a not very good performer, pretty much, and a very unassuming personality, really, until very close to the very end of the show, at which point she comes out of her shell and is a...
And her clothes.
Exactly. So, or very little actually out of her clothes.
That's true, actually,
I mean, there's only one sort of what you could call strip there.
Well, I think there's hot fleshings action.
Indeed. So, I mean, those are quite interesting sort of factors around it. Like, it has to be written deliberately down from the level it's at, and really, it only manages that because it is written at such a high level. It has some of the cleverest lyrics in musical theatre history. I mean, better than some of the best from, as it were, the authentic era of the great musical that it's sort of referring back to.
the Cole Porter's, the Ira Gershwins.
My particular favourite is the one in Together Wherever We Go, the Together, which is...
an Act 2
and
number.
N-E-I-O-U-I-O-U-O, which
Yes.
is probably one of the cleverest lyrics ever written, I should think.
The one he's always proud of is the Amigo line, isn't it? Because I think Stephen Sondheim rather understandably proudly boasts he was talking. The fact that you can do this, we forget this, but he knew Cole Porter, and not well, but he was talking to Cole Porter about lyrics, and Cole Porter was one of the masters of the triple comedy, where you make the line, the second line that rhymes, and then the third line that rhymes, which is where the punchline is.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a traditional trope, but Cole Porter made a particular art of that. He's got the wherever I go, he goes. Wherever she goes, we goes, or whatever it is, and then it's amigos, and that's the one he always says. Right. And he pulled that out of the bag for Cole Porter, and Cole Porter, he says, gasped.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean,
it was an asthma attack.
Exactly, yeah.
He wasn't a well man.
They're brilliant thing, and there are also a particular brilliance of the way that the score is bookended by the I Have a Dreams and the various leitmotifs in Some People, which all return with vicious irony in the final number, Rose's Turn.
Well, Rose's Turn is clever, isn't it? Because you're exactly as you say, in a writing exercise, it's got lots of musical beats which are from the score we've heard so far. So right at the beginning, that ba 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 ba, it's very strippy, which we just heard.
Yes.
And then she talks about Some People, which of course is one of the earliest songs.
Indeed.
So much of it is, as you say, it's drawn. It brings its threads together to make this final.
Everything's Coming Up Roses, which is the end of Act 1 number, also is referred to in that sequence.
I even as we were watching it today, I suddenly realised that the title has two meanings, because it's called Rose's Turn.
Yes.
And it's Rose's turn in the sense it's her, in the queue, shall we say, it's her turn because everyone else has gone and she's showing what she can do or can't.
Yes.
But it's Rose's turn because it's when she has that traditional, I would call now, Sondheimian thematic thing of somebody having either a nervous breakdown or a massive realisation.
Yes.
She goes demented, basically.
Sort of in the sense of a funny turn, yes.
That's exactly it. Is Rose having a turn,
yes.
To use the old-fashioned sense of that meaning?
Yes, I think that's exactly intentional. And,
And you were talking about the performance difficulties and the writing cleverness.
Yeah. So I mean, well, those are the challenges that the show sets itself, and it really passes them with quite amazingly flying colours. I mean, a lot of these numbers that at the time were written to sort of be as if they were from a musical of the time have become standards. I mean, Everything's Coming Up Roses, All I Really Need Is the Girl, many others besides.
Together is in
Some
if nothing
People,
else is in a lot of pantomimes,
right.
actually, and they often get recorded in sort of divas albums. I mean, almost everyone's had a go.
Well, they're all very good standalone numbers, as well as
Some People,
by and large, advancing the story. There's only one well-known exception, which is Mr. Goldstone. How they brought Mr. Goldstone, and that's
just a souffle of nothing.
Yes, it is. It's again Cole Porter-esque, but unfortunately, it doesn't do any dramatic work. But pretty much all of the others do significant dramatic work and really help bring the story together. So it's close to flawless. I mean, as a piece of musical theatre writing, and alongside West Side Story, which of course, now I'm just trying to remember which order these went in. I think it was West Side Story first, and then GYPSY for in terms of the stage productions. I think I'm right in saying
both Arthur Lawrence, though.
Both Arthur Lawrence doing the book. That's right. So and of course they were followed some years later by Anyone Can Whistle, which of course the first time that particular combination of writers crashed.
Yes, of course. Although once again, another thing, well, not quite nervous breakdown in this case, but mental breakdowns, and you see that again in Follies as well. So some of the thematic stuff, you can put a lot of that in the pot, stir it up, and come up with different solutions.
It created a new cliche.
It did, in fact,
which was the the R&I's vaudeville or musical theatre number, and they got there first.
It also, we were talking about the cleverness of the lyrics, actually, and just by touching on that point about some of those songs being standards, a lot of those songs I knew before I'd seen GYPSY the first time I saw it, which was, as you say, the Rosalind Russell film. And they make perfectly good standards because the lyrics work as written, and then they work with the level of irony which you see in the performances.
Yeah.
So actually, it's like Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, which we discussed from Meet Me in St. Louis, which is when it's sung at Christmas, is ostensibly supposed to be a fairly cheerful, if certainly not too maudlin, Christmas song.
But in fact, it refers to someone trying to gain great hope out of a hopeless situation, isn't it? In fact, it's what it was originally written.
Exactly. So the standard version doesn't have the same emotional purpose as the stage version, and I think that's true of many of the songs that have come out of the score of GYPSY.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's why they're done today as standalone numbers, and work very well in their own right. But given that dramatic context, they take on a whole new significance. And
that was really driven home to me today in the performance we've seen.
Yes.
Because actually there's so much more to the emotion of each song which can only be seen when you see it performed, not just the audio recording.
Which brings us neatly to Imelda Staunton as the central sort of, point of the person in the show.
Just honoured in the New Year's Honours list, quite rightly, for services to acting.
Yes, indeed, and this is definitely one of them.
Yes.
So she
was making sure.
It's a very, I mean, in some ways, very broadly painted character. You know, she's very smart and snappy and rude and pushy and all of those things, and
seemingly self-contained
to a really amazing degree. You know, I mean, much further than the average sort of theatrical pushy mum. But there she is at the back at the very beginning, of course, shouting "Sing out, Louise!" And we see her gradually unravel, and her life gradually unravel in this thing. And she is, very much the central character. She doesn't emerge as the success or as the person who achieves success, but she sort of epitomises the psychosis of the ideas of American theatre and of American musicals. In other words, that there's always hope. These sort of spunky characters, that we see lauded in musicals like Annie, or that we see lauded in classic American musicals, the Annie type of person, or which you should take your pick of Annies, whether it's the or Calamity Jane, or all these sort of these spunky characters. She sort of epitomises that. But of course, what the show illustrates is that that's just what people are like in musicals. If you're like that in real life, you're
a disaster.
You're going to go nuts.
Well, here's my question. Is it possible to feel sympathy for Mama Rose? She is a monster. Certainly in this version. I think when you listen...
More so, I'd say, than in the Bette Midler version.
Well, yes, I think when you listen to the recording of various scores, actually it's easy, or relatively easy, to feel some sympathy for her at the end when she's having her turn.
Yeah.
But I think in this, she is such a monster that it's very hard to feel sympathy for her. It's also hard to see how people stay with her for any other reason than the fact they're being oppressed by her.
I think what came through in this more than perhaps other performances is that she is driven by a kind of a madness, that she's effectively, she's the prisoner of her own will to power, as it were, and that she doesn't have any control over it either. It really is a sort of, a hysterical, psychotic thing that's got hold of her. And one by one, the people around her realise that they're not going to change her. And of course, particularly her intended, this
Herbie
at this point,
who goes bananas.
Indeed. So, and gradually, one by one, they come to the realisation that she never herself can, is that she cannot change. She sort of talks about it. As soon as there's just even the slightest whiff, the tiniest fragment of hope that's strewn before her, or even a fragment of hope that she can just invent herself in the darkest of circumstances, she seizes upon that and can do no other than decide that this is the resurrection of the dream of theatrical success that she's pursued for reasons she can't even explain to herself until the end, for the rest of her life. And no matter how many people think, well, eventually she'll calm down, settle down, and things will get better, or if Mama got married and so on, it never comes, that moment. And the great tragedy of her life is that.
And we see that writ large, don't we? When the fact, she's very, very sneery about moving from vaudeville into burlesque.
Yes.
And she's very down on all the burlesque performers, who oddly have a strange camaraderie, it turns out, even though there's jealousy within it. But the only chance when she's absolutely at rock bottom, and indeed there's subtitles and sort of scene titles throughout the entire piece, and it's called The Bottom, which works both for the fact that you're in a burlesque and bottoms are very much part of the menu of that, but also rock bottom is what they've hit.
Yes.
But we get this moment when, in fact, as you say, the lead burlesque actress is arrested for prostitution, essentially, I think, picking people up.
Yes,
and so there's a gap at the top of the bill, and so although she hates burlesque, apparently, she
considers herself above it and her daughter above it, she then seizes on that one possibility and pushes her daughter into undertaking a strip. And
isn't it telling that she makes sure that the stage name, even though it goes wrong for her, has the word Rose in it, her own title? That's
it is. She's a horrifying character, and yes, you can have sympathy for her, I think, but really only on those terms that you can see that she can't escape.
But this is, can I ask though, is this sympathy as someone who's never going to meet her, i.e. an audience member, or is it, could you feel sympathy for her if you were in her life?
No,
exactly. You have to feel sympathy for everyone else.
I think that's what the show's about.
She also doesn't, interestingly, have any redemption, does she? Because even at the end...
No, she can't, and I think
she can't. Yes, she cannot.
This is really where it sort of goes beyond the world of Rodgers and Hammerstein, I think, and I think in a sense that's...
I think she passed that about halfway through Act 1.
Well, Sondheim having sort of, grown up, as it were, in the shadow of Hammerstein and his rather sunny view of human nature, here I think turns it deeply in the opposite direction. Like West Side Story does the same thing actually as well. It's things don't turn out for the best.
No.
And while there is some possibility of redemption at the end of West Side Story, what has been done cannot be undone, and there is and the tragedy is just regrettable and adds very little to the glory of the world. And so it is here, but more so really because, as you say, she's one child has achieved escape velocity and success, possibly two. We don't know exactly what happened to baby June. But here, there's no hope that the character can ever reconcile to the fact that she was never the star, and that's a very bitter and rather unsympathetic place for her to be.
And there's that very odd ending, isn't it, where she finishes her last sort of significant speech is that she's got one final dream, which is basically still to leech off her one remaining daughter, Louise, Gypsy Rose Lee. There's this odd... I mean, it's a kind of will you, won't you? I mean, obviously it's not going to happen because Gypsy Rose doesn't need it, and she wouldn't anyway. But, the idea of mother and daughter stripping in burlesque together is...
Yes, it's very, very strange notion.
Grotesque. Really.
But I think this is all of a piece with that type of character where, the more distant the dream becomes, the more outlandish the dream becomes too.
Yeah.
And, it's the sort of narcissist's fantasy world.
And you picked it up very well, and you can see it so clearly, so perfectly, and yet so subtly in Imelda Staunton's performance, which is the fact that you can see the moments when she's demented or when she's utterly tunnel-visioned. It's tunnel-visioned,
that's right.
Even though there's a train coming towards her.
That's right, yeah. You can see, as you say, you see it like she conducts herself in a social manner, really, for most of the thing, even occasionally charming, although rarely. But yes, there are these moments when you can, as you say, you see the blinkers come down and she shakes, and there's
the mouth
a sort of,
does a kind of
the mouth
wobble.
does something. Yes, she looks serious. I mean, that's how you know she's. And I suppose the first big moment of that kind comes at the end of Act 1 when she realises that more than half of her act has gone off on the road and abandoned her
And married.
And again,
each other.
Yes, exactly. And then we see it again, of course, at that moment at the burlesque theatre, and we see it. At other times, basically, when people leave.
And people warn her all the way through. I mean, Herbie, isn't there this scene where actually it's in a Chinese restaurant.
That's right.
And he is saying, look, you've got to marry me. I'm not going to just be your fancy bit, as it were.
Yes.
And you can't just carry on using me as your agent. And it's a lovely song. But throughout that, he says, look, I will go unless you do this for me. And she keeps putting him off. And he's reconciled to it in the sense there's a further promise that it will happen one day.
Yeah.
And he's happy to work towards her ambition, which is to get a child who becomes a star if she'll marry him. But she just ignores everything.
Yes, that's right. I mean, she's a highly manipulative,
dreadful person.
Dreadful person, but but she makes great care.
Now, what do you make of Herbie? Because that's quite a difficult act, isn't it? He's just a nice man.
Yes, pulled along in her wake very much, and good-natured and sweet. Played by Peter Davison here, who specialises in that kind of thing, and willing to compromise, which of course is what the foil that character needs, because she's totally not willing to compromise under.
The thing about Herbie is he's about the only character who's got real heart in the piece,
right.
By which I mean the younger daughter, June, disappears at the end of Act 1, having married Tulsa, one of the boys in the act, but we don't see any of that relationship. Only time we ever see her really being herself is actually when she and her sister are singing If Mama Was Married, which is a beautiful, wonderful song. But so we don't see that. Actually, Gypsy, should we call her that?
Yes.
Louise, she's so passive. You see her, and you quite rightly point out her sexual awakening occurring, but you don't see much of her heart. All you see is her longing to be recognised and spotted by her mother.
To be an individual, and I think where you do see it is in that number All I Really Need Is the Girl, which does give her the first chance. I think that's the first time we really do see behind that sort of that mask.
And the sadness of that is, of course, the girl that he's after is not her. It turns out, and it's not revealed then, is it?
No.
But actually, Herbie is the character with heart.
Yes,
he's the only nice character, really.
No, that's not true.
No, do you think?
Because Louise is
well,
a nice
all right. Nice is the wrong word. He's the only character who's overtly a normal person throughout the piece.
Yes, that's true. I mean, his ambitions aren't particularly high, but then Louise's ambitions aren't particularly pronounced either, really. As you rightly say, all she wants to be is to be seen as a person in her own right. That's all she wants. Mm-hmm. She'd probably be happy to do that in Alaska or Washington or,
anywhere on the road.
Anywhere on the road, exactly. Back in Seattle, So both of those really are just this sort of weight of normalcy, as it were, on Rose. And of course the grandfather, who seems to be well motivated, even if he's not necessarily the most wonderful person.
But he's such a bit part, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. He sets them on their travels in a way, doesn't he?
Indeed.
And we should talk about Louise, the actress, because that's a very difficult part, because you have to be spotted and overshadowed. You have to be, as you said earlier, a bad actor
And
or a
bad
good actor
singer,
doing
and-
bad.
yes.
And then you actually have to find yourself. You have to, it's watching someone grow up professionally
Yeah.
and sexually
Yep.
and emotionally later on.
Yes. It's a real tricky part, and in some ways it's very sort of deliberately, disregarded. It's a really interesting structure actually for a show. Having talked about that, because I mean that's a great challenge for an actress to push oneself into the shadows basically, and to not emerge until quite a late stage. But also an interesting way of dealing with the drama, because of course the mother is the central character, and therefore she's the motive force behind the whole thing. But for June, who, if you don't know the piece, you might imagine is going to be the next generation, the person who we sort of follow to wherever she's going next.
Well, we believe the mother when she says she's going to be
disappears.
a star.
She just vanishes out of the piece entirely, and just before the end of Act 1. And we never ever see her again, and so suddenly we have to get to know this whole different girl.
Yes, that's true. It's based on a novel.
Who's
of course,
hard to know.
Or rather a book.
Yes,
It's the memoirs
of Gypsy Rosie.
Yeah. And that will be a
Based
biographical.
loosely on it.
Well, of course, very much so. But it is a biography, and therefore it's not written as a drama. It's written as an unfolding text, shall we say.
Yes.
Let's talk about the televisual constraints, because we did this with The Sound of Music. I think it's fair to say that although it was a stage production and it was being televised, it wasn't just point the camera at the stage and but bearing in mind the direction we are seeing is the direction that was made for the stage production and for people sitting in that auditorium.
Yes.
And as a result of that, television has to impose its constraints on top of that, whilst not in any way undoing anything that's happening on stage.
It attempts to direct your attention to certain sort of significant bits of acting, I suppose.
Well, it aims at the drama. We spotted that particularly in All I Need Now Is the Girl, when the camera, quite rightly, kept focusing on Louise watching and us
But there's
seeing
a particular
her.
moment, I think, where it sort of pulls away from some really, some quite involved choreography that Tulsa is doing, and focuses on her reactions to it, and I think that's a very sound decision.
But it doesn't always work. There were some moments in one of the early songs where they appeared to be cutting from camera to camera on the beats of one of the songs.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I didn't quite work. It was trying to make the direction, if you like, based on the rhythms and structure of a song. And in fact, it wasn't being done on the drama of the song.
Well, perhaps because it makes the camera cutting and all that sort of stuff more obtrusive. And, it means you focus on that more than you focus on what's happening on the stage, which after all is the point.
Yes, although I did think there were a couple of occasions where we missed what was going on because we were having a close-up. There was a transition going on. Sometimes the transitions are quite jolly or helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the object of the transition sequence where the children grow up basically in one single swoop is that then they get swapped out one by one. And again, this is staged identically to the TV version, the Bette Midler one, which is to say that it's covered over by strobe lights, and there's this general effect of sort of as if you're watching a bit of film footage almost, and they're marching on the spots, in exactly the same way. It's identical, as I say. And gradually one by one being swapped out. And then the camera aided the theatrical technique of trying to disguise the swappings out so that they became seamless, by actually just focusing down on one little bit at a time, rather than obviously being able to see the whole picture. It kind of worked in terms of that, so that the transition was surprising when all the lights came back on and you realised they were all 10 years older at least.
Yes.
If not 20, in a couple of cases, I thought.
Yeah, they were quite mature, some of the 15-year-olds.
Yes.
Possibly 30, as you say.
Yeah.
But also it does that thing of giving you close-ups, which, unless you're in the stalls, you don't get in a theatre. You have to play to the back row of the upper circle. So the television demands a different kind of performance. That's probably not quite fair to say, but television demands a particular performance, which isn't always the first thing that's demanded on stage, if it makes sense.
Yes.
But this is such an emotional piece. I assume that we were getting the performance that happened every night, that they weren't being particularly subtle for the camera on the night of the
No, I assume not.
cameras.
I guess Savoy is not the biggest theatre in the world, is it?
No, by no means.
And so I think from quite a few angles you would be able to see some of the detail of those performances.
It was also narrowed up, if you remember rightly, because although it is in itself a proscenium arch, they'd done that thing again where they'd added sort of extra flanks on either side of the stage,
right, yeah.
which is where they put the rolling blind, which told you what scene you were in,
That's
with
right,
its
yes,
sort of heading of where
Yes,
you were in the country and
They'd
what was
made it
going
look more
on.
like a vaudeville
Yeah. bill.
Theatre, basically, yeah, or theatre, yeah.
What did you think of the design?
Excellent. I mean, again, the design was there very much to serve, as it were, a straight revival of the thing. You know, I mean, effectively, this was a performance for people to go and see who were too young to catch Ethel Merman in the original, I suspect.
Oh, only for people 60 and younger.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Which is unusual, really, because a lot of theatres aimed at the exact opposite
reverse,
demographic,
yes.
but there we are. Yeah, no, it seemed to me to want to very much recapture the spirit of the original, and I think it, well, I mean, as best as I can judge, it did, but obviously I wasn't there
Well, I have a
when
suspicion
Merman did it.
we might have had a bit more subtlety.
Perhaps so, yeah. But yes, I mean, it was staged in a very faithful way. I mean, we had certain design tropes whereby there was a little bit of forced perspective in some of the sets and things like that. Which
Lovely bookcases were at angles.
Yes, yes. It's a forced perspective, and so there was a bit of that. The vaudeville set was very, it did that thing which, of course, the music also does, of being just a little bit too good for what they're trying to portray. So while the lyrics are deliberately written down, and while some of the choreography is deliberately got wrong, actually the overall quality of what you see, and certainly what you hear, the musicians don't put a single note wrong, which of course wouldn't have been the case for an act like that.
No,
they'd have just had the music thrust in front of them, some seconds before, and
they might have
just
been
be struggling their way
drinking,
through it, and probably wouldn't. It wasn't until they got onto the Orpheum circuit they weren't playing with the best possible artists. So I think that's a little conceit that you sort of let them get away with, and I think the sets also partook of that in the sense that the sets that they were presented were much less battered than they would have been on being on the road, and perhaps a little bit more ambitious in terms of what they could do.
Although they were very cheesy, the proper vaudeville things they started in the 1920s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's such a great thing, that whole either Baby June or Dainty June and her, either newsboys or farm boys, and how they just don't change the act, regardless of the fact that you've moved from downtown Brooklyn or wherever it's supposed to be, New York, into the country.
Well, I love the payoff of that, which, as we've already said, is the fact that it turns out that the words of the act of that vaudeville act worked perfectly in the burlesque thing, because not just the "let me entertain you,"
yes,
but even the things which are "let me raise your spirits" has a secondary meaning for gentlemen watching scantily clad ladies.
Well, I think the thing is, it was interesting though, because the older the musical has got, the more the first time round you hear it, the more you hear the double meaning the first time, and of course, perhaps to the more innocent audiences of the late 50s who originally saw this, they would have accepted the cute Shirley Temple girl act without reading any sort of lascivious
second meaning,
double entendre into those lyrics. We live in less innocent times now, and of course when you hear people singing words like that, you can't help but anticipate where it's going to go in the second act. But it does it very well.
So we're both agreed, I think, that it was a masterful version of a masterful piece, and it was very good that we got to see it on television this Christmas. But my question, I think probably to finish us with today, is could they have done Gypsy the way that ITV chose to do The Sound of Music, i.e. not do it on stage, but do what we've described as a televisual interpretation of it, i.e. in sets, in a TV studio somewhere, to make it no longer stage bound but not cinematic either?
But by and large, I would think you probably could, and I think it is possible, and I don't see why they shouldn't, and perhaps they will at some point. It's all stagey stuff. In fact, if anything, the Bette Midler version sort of demonstrated that, really, made for TV, largely on sound stages,
but not live. So they had the opportunity of planning it that way. Yes.
I think perhaps the lack of a live orchestra, which of course the Sound of Music lacked one, could be a downside, but I'm sure they could work around that.
Well, conversely, actually, this is the one area where I may be speaking heresy here, but actually I preferred the music quality in terms of the lushness and fullness of the orchestra, even if it was pre-recorded in The Sound of Music, to the, by necessity, relatively medium-sized orchestra of the Savoy Theatre. Right. I felt that it could have, if it didn't have quite enough, the big enough sound, certainly in the overture, which actually sounded a bit synthed.
I agree, actually. I mean, I think it's a very lushly written, the overture in particular, score for that kind of thing. Very heavy on the brass, which I think they certainly didn't stint on in this, but you're right.
You mean they spent some brass on it?
The rest of the instrumentation, obviously, there's, in the overture, in the version, again, you hear on the albums, there's a big string section. Yeah. And of course, there isn't. They can't, West End bands, they just can't be these days. It's just not affordable, you can't do it. So yeah, in that sense, it would be nice to scale that up.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for talking about Gypsy with me. I suppose now is the time for me to tuck you up into your sort of netting bed.
Yes, that's very nice.
Because everyone's got to have a
My
hammock.
Oh dear! I was going to do a little gag there, but I think you did slightly better.
Oh,
You would have been nothing without me. That's all I can say.
Right, put your clothes back on.
All right.
Thanks very much, Tim. Musical talk. And there we have it. That was Tim Sayward joining me to talk about Gypsy Live. And as you can hear, our love of the show came through in the conversation, and our love of that production also. It was a palpable hit. Very, very different to the way that The Sound of Music Live had been done, but equally successful in a very, very different production style. We praised ITV last week for its braveness in putting on a live version of The Sound of Music. We can only praise the BBC also for telecasting a successful stage show. And we both hoped we're going to see rather more of that in the future. But Gypsy is of course an unusual show in the sense that it's named after someone who is arguably not the central character at all. Louise is no Pippin, shall we say. She's very much a minor character who develops certainly as the piece goes on. But really your eye is always on Mama Rose. And I think that was very astutely picked up by the American reviewer Frank Rich, who wrote of the original production, Gypsy is nothing if not Broadway's own brassy, unlikely answer to King Lear. And Clive Barnes noted that Mama Rose was one of the few truly complex characters in American musical. Now, that's quite an ambitious statement. I'm not sure I truly agree. In 1959, I suspect that was true. But I think since then, Stephen Sondheim and many others have given us hugely flawed and complex characters. But Mama Rose is the archetype. But is she a monster? Well, you heard Tim and I discussing it. The question was, can you feel sympathy for Rose? And this is a question that's still discussed today. Walter Kerr said that although Rose is a monster, she must be liked and understood for the show to work. Patti Lupone, who has played Rose, says she has tunnel vision, she's driven and she loves her kids. And she is a survivor. I don't see her as a monster at all. She may do monstrous things, but that does not make her a monster. Sondheim himself said of the character, the fact that she's monstrous to her daughters and the world is secondary. She's a very American character, a gallant figure and a life force. The writer Ben Brantley said that Rose is a mythic character and is traditionally presented as an armoured tank on autopilot, which finally crashes only minutes before the final curtain. And that is, of course, how she's traditionally played. Bernadette Peters, who's also played Rose, however, thinks very differently. She says Rose was a woman who was traumatised by her own mother leaving her at an early age. I think that longing for acceptance is what fuels all her ambition. In the end, when she confronts herself in Rose's Turn, the song at the end, she realises she has failed her daughter just as her own mother failed her, and that destroys Rose. There is a vulnerability to Rose that makes her human, not just some loud and cartoonish parody of a stage mother. And my own take on Rose, and I think this is brought out beautifully in the Imelda Staunton version, is that actually, at the end of the day, the success that she's seeking for her children is really the success that she's looking for herself. And that absolutely comes out in that final scene where she tries to muscle in on Gypsy Rose Lee's great success as a striptease artist by flying a kite of an idea to see if it would be possible to go on stage with her as a mother and daughter stripping team. It seems such a grotesque idea, but she's clinging on to this idea that some glory must come to her as the mother. And let's briefly recap the ending. In the BBC's televised version, we see Rose left on stage after Rose's Turn and the confrontation with her daughter, and Louise, Gypsy Rose Lee, starts to walk off. But Rose, stumbling, catches up with her, and Gypsy Rose Lee puts her arm round her. Now that arm, I think, is possibly the most significant action in the entire piece, because it symbolises forgiveness, if not acceptance. If she hadn't put her arm around her, that will be the breakup of their relationship. But by putting her arm around her, it shows a new relationship. It's one of forgiveness and dominance by Louise. And Stephen Sondheim himself says, yet the end of Gypsy is not entirely bleak. Louise comes out a star and forgives her mother. There is hope for her. Rose does confront who she is in Rose's Turn. There is a catharsis. It's not Rodgers and Hammerstein, he adds interestingly. This is Sondheim, remember. But you feel maybe the mother and daughter will come to an understanding and maybe triumph over Rose's craziness and Louise's bitterness. Now, something that's amazing to me is that Gypsy was such a success on Broadway, but it didn't come immediately to the London West End stage. In fact, it didn't reach London until 1973, when, interestingly, I think, Elaine Stritch was identified as playing Mama Rose. However, she bowed out and was replaced by Angela Lansbury before the show opened because the production team couldn't get backers on the strength of Elaine Stritch's name. And so it was that the show opened in London for the very first time, as a professional production, on the 29th of May 1973, with Angela Lansbury as Mama Rose at the Piccadilly Theatre, directed amazingly by Arthur Lawrence, who wrote the show. Interestingly, elsewhere online, the actor Stanley Stewart, who was appearing in London at that time in the show called The Philanthropist, remembers attending a pros-invited audience matinee, i.e. a performance specifically for other people in the business, which was introduced by Arthur Lawrence, the director. And he recalled having taken his seat in the audience and being asked to move in by one place so that Lauren Bacall, who was playing in Her Majesty's Theatre in Applause, which was of course by Charles Strauss, could take a seat by the aisle as she needed to leave quietly during the performance at 4 o'clock to go for a hairdressing appointment. Sandy Stewart also recalls the following, and I'm going to read this quotation directly because I think it's so charming. Can I indulge in a further anecdote, as I haven't mentioned the sheer joy of the three strippers? What's wrong with stripping? Bellows the bulldyke. These are his words. In 1964, I'd just finished a year in rep, my galley years, and had a week in London before I did a season at the Gateway Theatre in Edinburgh, and my agent got me a pass for the Palladium rehearsals of Night of 100 Stars, an annual event for charity. The strippers, the Gotta Get a Gimmick number, was taken by Miriam Carling, Barbara Windsor and Millicent Martin, and how they worked at characterisation with side-splitting efficiency. Le Windsor won the day as her lower physique was suddenly highlighted with lit bulbs on. I'm electrifying, and I'm not even trying. Totally gauche and fey. Well, that's it for Gypsy, I think. A marked success on stage and now on television. Long may its reign continue. But I did say at the beginning of this programme, this wasn't the only time that Gypsy Rose Lee found herself in a musical. And the musical in question was Pal Joey by Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart, and is almost a kind of proto-run of Guys and Dolls. It has a book written by John O'Hara and is based on a character, that's Pal Joey himself, who is a manipulative small-time nightclub performer, and situations that O'Hara had created himself in a series of short stories published in The New Yorker, which he later then republished in a novel form. This feels very much like Damon Runyon, of course. The original Broadway production was in 1940, and of course it has some wonderful songs, including I Could Write a Book and Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered. But the song I'm talking about is called Zip, which of course refers to the zips used as part of the striptease work done by Gypsy Rose Lee. And the song comes about in a scene in the club run by Joey himself, where he meets a reporter whose name is Melba, who was later played in 1952 by the great Elaine Stritch, her second mention in today's programme, who interviews Joey, but in the course of doing so recalls some of her great interviews of the past with huge celebrities, including Gypsy Rose Lee, who's the person she identifies as being the greatest artist that she had ever interviewed. And the conceit of the song, and it is a wonderful song, is that Gypsy Rose Lee was very much an intellectual and intelligent woman who, while she was going through the motions of a gentle, slow striptease, using the zips on her costume to slowly reveal her form, she was actually thinking great thoughts, shall we say. And here's just one example from the lyrics, which give you an idea. And remember, this is a reporter describing what Gypsy Rose Lee had said to her in an interview as she stripped. Zip. Walter Lippmann wasn't brilliant today. Zip. Will Sir Ryan ever write a great play? Zip. I was reading Schopenhauer last night. Zip. And I think that Schopenhauer was right. And it all pays off in the last line, which is when she declares herself to be a broad with a broad, broad mind. And if this song is ringing a bell with you, Elaine Stritch carried on performing it right up until the end of her life. And if you saw Elaine Stritch at Liberty, her one-woman show only a few years ago, she performed it then, and it was as marvellous in the 21st century as it was when she first performed it in 1952. Well, very much like Gypsy Rose Lee, I hope in this episode of Musical Talk we have slowly revealed the truth, the worth, the brilliance of the wonderful show, Gypsy. But all good things must come to an end. Although in a striptease, often there's a big revelation at the end. But I'm sorry to say, ladies and gentlemen, you won't be getting that from me. I'm wearing not only 14 layers, I'm wearing a 12-piece suit, undergarments made of hessian, and an overcoat. There'll be no stripping from me. So on that disappointment, or perhaps delight, I shall say to you, goodbye. And by that, I mean, well, goodbye. This has been episode 468 of Musical Talk, which was edited and produced by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood. Copyright Musical Talk 2016. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our brand new website, musicaltalkpodcast.weebly.com, or subscribe to us on iTunes, and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. The thing about Herbie is, actually, he's almost the only character with real heart in the police. Sorry, I'll say that. The first daughter, the younger daughter, Jane, she goes off and marries someone, but actually we don't see any of that relationship. We know...
June.
June. Whatever happened to baby Jane?